Hey everyone, my name is Carell, and today we're going to be taking a look at one of the most dangerous guards in Meet Your Maker, the Cannonback. Weighing in at a pricey 70 capacity, this guard still shares most of its behaviors and mods with other guards. So for more information about that, you can go check out the first 11 minutes or so of my Enforcer guide. I'll have a link to that down in the description. Anyway, moving on to the specifics of the Cannonback. Once this thing's activated, the guard will wait until it can see the raider. Then it will take about 1 3/4 seconds to load up and fire a large flashy bomb that detonates about 1 1/4 seconds after impact, either impact with a guard or a surface or the raider themselves. If the raider moves out of line of sight of the Cannonback once that loading and firing animation has begun, the Cannonback will still fire its shot at the last known location of the raider. This behavior has caught many a raider by surprise, and by many a raider I mean me. So many times. I swear those bombs seem like they're homing sometimes. Now, in terms of defending against these things, both ranged weapons and both swords can destroy the bombs quite easily. They can be deflected by the arc barriers and shields, though this won't destroy the bomb itself, and explosions that take place from the Cannonback bombs outside of a deployable shield will, of course, not harm the raider inside the shield. Now, likewise, the bomb will destroy all traps, guards, and raiders in its roughly 1.5 block explosion radius. Next up, let's take a look at the armor plating mod for Cannonbacks in more detail. The armor plating is quite comprehensive. It does cover a lot of the Cannonback. It covers the right arm, it covers the shoulders, it covers the torso, it covers the legs. What it does not cover are the head, the cannon arm itself, or the back of the Cannonback. So those are your weak spots for killing this thing. However, this thing does not get locked into any sort of an animation that prevents it from turning, ever. As such, it will basically always face the player while it's activated, so it can be very difficult for inexperienced players to try and kill one of these things, especially if they're running the light sword and trying to kill it with that. It's very hard to lock onto the cannon arm, if that's even possible. I haven't tried it, to be honest. And the head moves around a lot, and as such is quite a difficult target. So inexperienced players are going to have a pretty tough time killing an armored Cannonback. However, experienced raiders will have no trouble whatsoever killing these with almost any weapon combination. The Volt Lancer and Plasma Crossbow in particular will make short work of even the armored Cannonbacks because it doesn't cover the head and it doesn't cover the giant cannon arm. When these things go to fire, they raise this cannon arm into position over their heads, and that is a giant weak spot. Basically, you can shoot that cannon from almost any distance, and it will instantly kill the Cannonback. Aiming for the head is actually harder than hitting the cannon because the head's a smaller target, and it kind of bobs and weaves and moves around a lot, especially as the Cannonback is preparing to fire. So, yeah, in most cases you're better off just aiming for the giant exposed cannon. You're going to one-shot the thing if you hit that, so don't even bother with the head or the back or anything else. Just shoot the cannon. It should be noted here that even though Cannonbacks are easy enough to kill with almost any weapon combination, Fury's Edge and Arc Barrier is by far the most awkward combination to use. To get the kill with Fury's Edge, the raider absolutely has to get to the Cannonback from behind or headshot it, which that's quite difficult since the firing animation moves the Cannonback's head all around until it's just ready to fire. And so the Arc Barrier is oddly enough your best tool to use in this case because you can just walk up to the Cannonback, and either in the process of walking up you can kick the bomb back towards the Cannonback, or you can just stand in its face until it fires a shot at you and hits you. The shot itself will not deal any damage to you, so you can just pop the arc barrier to survive the ensuing explosion. The Cannonback, fortunately for all of us, doesn't own an arc barrier, and therefore will be killed by its own cannonball. So to demonstrate some of these methods, I just have an armored Cannonback sitting out in the open there, and there's a few different things I'm going to demonstrate here. First, I can just kind of kick the cannonball back towards the Cannonback, and it dies. I don't even need weapons for this. All I have to do is walk towards the thing at the correct distance and at the correct time. That's probably the safest method here. If I try and go in with the Fury's Edge, you can see I have to aim pretty carefully, but I can hit the head of the thing with a little bit of precision aim. But I do have to wait until the cannonball is almost ready to fire, and if I aim and miss and hit the armor there, I'm going to be recoiled, and that's probably a bad thing with a cannonball in the near vicinity, and not really what you want there. The last thing we're going to try here, we're just going to let the Cannonback shoot us from close range. and then we just pop the arc barrier right as the cannonball goes off, and the Cannonback dies, we don't, and we can just move on with our lives here. 3 different methods to kill a Cannonback, very easily and simply, even with the worst weapon combination for it. Now, some other particularly good mods for the Cannonback are the Reflex Manipulation mod and the Optical Implant mod. Reflex Manipulation, of course, will increase the Cannonback's fire rate by approximately 15%. Since the Cannonback has a longer prep time to fire than most of the other guards, Reflex Manipulation shaves off the largest absolute amount of time from the Cannonback's firing cycle. So Reflex Manipulation here is quite good on Cannonbacks, and it really makes them fire very, very quickly, much quicker than a Raider will usually expect. So I very highly advocate that you put Reflex Manipulation on Cannonbacks whenever you have the opportunity to do so. Another good one here is Optical Implant. Again, that increases the range of the Cannonback's vision. It's a pretty significant range increase, and it will help the Cannonback start firing sooner and get shots off at longer range. Especially in large rooms, that can mean that the Cannonback will engage sooner and keep firing longer when the Raider's in the area, and it just means that the Raider has that much more trouble seeing the cannonballs coming at them. Most Raiders won't scan that far out for potential threats. They tend to concentrate on the threats that are closer to them, which, to be fair, is what they should be doing. But the optical implant will very often surprise a Raider by allowing the Cannonback to fire well outside the actual area that the Raider is scanning for threats. Now, normally I wouldn't say this for other guards, but in the case of the Cannonback specifically, despite how good the armor plating is, like I said, experienced Raiders are going to tear through that. They'll either bring a plasma crossbow and just shoot the thing in the arm, or they'll figure out some way of dealing with it. So that's really only terribly effective against the less experienced Raiders. However, there are some really good use cases for Cannonbacks that we're not discarding the Cannonback itself. What I am saying is that very often using range with optical implant and rapid fire from reflex manipulation is going to disrupt an experienced Raider far more than the actual armor plating will. So consider if you actually need armor plating on your Cannonbacks. Sometimes just putting the Cannonback a little bit further away and making it fire faster is going to do more for you. Next, let's talk tactics. So in general, Cannonbacks are best used in kind of semi-enclosed areas rather than perfectly open areas, because the bombs are affected by gravity and generally won't detonate mid-air. So, for instance, in this particular area here, if I, as a Raider, walk across this pathway, and these Cannonbacks are firing at me, ignore this one for the moment, if these two are firing at me and I'm just literally walking straight down this pathway, they will never hit me. The cannonballs will roll off the pathway and just kind of roll off into the distance. However, if I was to put, walls around this pathway and, say, put a Cannonback here and have this Cannonback back here, those cannonballs will kind of roll along the pathway and they'll be really quite difficult to deal with. They'll be very difficult to avoid in that enclosed environment, because if I body block any of the cannonballs, there's a very significant chance that I will give them, that is the cannonball, the same velocity vector that I, as the Raider, want to travel along. So basically, if I'm grappling forward, I'm going to kick the cannonball along with me at a high rate of speed, and there's probably a reason I'm using that high rate of speed, right? I want to get out of the area. So if I'm carrying a cannonball along with me, that's very much not what I want. I either have to back off, in which case something behind me presumably catches up and kills me, or I just continue on forward and the cannonball just continues forward with me and kills me. That's not really what I want either. So Cannonbacks in enclosed areas tend to be very difficult for Raiders to avoid. However, there is another use case for these things, and that involves these wide open areas. So, for instance, if you have a difficult-to-enter hallway in here, so let's say we have some incinerators up top, we've got something off on the side here, we can just go ahead and throw an incinerator over here, we can throw in, let's say, a grappling hook over here, we can just spam some plasma sentinels up in the sky, maybe even with plasma cloud, just all sorts of things that we can do here to make the Raider really not want to exit this tunnel until they've dealt with some of those threats with a ranged weapon. In those cases, Cannonbacks are the kings of slopes and firing into small enclosed spaces from a wide open area. They have basically no limitations on their firing arc. They will fire straight if they need to. They will arc shots if they need to. They will just try and get a cannonball to wherever the raider's last known location was. So unlike other traps, like the incinerator, which will stop firing once they can't see the raider anymore, I mean, they might still have some flames coming out, but in general, if the raider pops their head out up here and the incinerator goes off and the raider backs away, the incinerator won't keep firing. The Cannonbacks, however, will have started their load animation and will continue to fire. They will get that cannonball shot in regardless of whether the raider backs off or not. And that's a very valuable property that can catch very cautious raiders by surprise a lot. And yes, that means me. Now, as I might have mentioned here, Cannonbacks are also the master of slopes. If you have a giant sloped area, a Cannonback at the top of that hill firing down at you is a terrifying thing, right? I mentioned this before, if it's in a tightly enclosed area and you're trying to climb against the grain with a Cannonback firing downhill at you, if any of those cannonballs hit you, you're going to take the cannonball along for the ride up the slope. However, if the cannonball hits you and starts going up the slope with you, you can't just back off from that. Unlike a normal hallway, I can't kick the cannonball down the slope and then back away the other direction. Well, hopefully not into a corrosive cube either, but I can't just kick it up a slope and then back away, because what's going to happen there is I kick the cannonball and then it starts rolling back down the slope towards me again. So I can't get away from that nearly so easily when there's a Cannonback firing down a slope at me. Now, likewise, a clever builder should never, ever, ever underestimate the power of horizontal slopes, especially in conjunction with Cannonbacks. These things are terrors for all slow raiders. So for instance, if I as a slow raider poke my head around here, I see there's a Cannonback, I'm armed with a melee weapon, I don't want to go out there. Yeah, that's very dangerous. And it gets even more effective if I, for instance, stay out here for a second. So for instance, that cannonball is just going to keep following me around that curve. And yeah, that can really get quite far around the corner, much further than most raiders will expect. Now, as you probably noticed by now, the actual danger indicator for a cannonball is kind of a circle around the targeting reticle. And that's all well and good, but there are a couple of other things in the game that do mimic that same danger indicator, and those can be used by a clever builder to kind of distract from the cannonballs themselves. For instance, these splatter corrosive cubes here. If I throw a grenade through one of these things, you'll see the splatter gives me that same danger indicator. And it's the same thing. It's identical to the danger indicator from the cannonball itself. So if I was to pop out here, have these things fired at me, it can become a lot more difficult rather, to see whether or not I'm being fired at and within the radius of a cannonball, or just happen to be near a splatter somewhere. So if you can get a Cannonback to reliably fire into a especially opaque splatter corrosive cube, the raider can't see the cannonball, so they don't know where it is or where it's going to explode, and the splatter can help disguise the danger indicator to make it even less likely that they'll be able to see where exactly the cannonball is going to explode, and more importantly, whether or not it's going to be lethal to them. As we've talked about a little bit already, it's very common to have Cannonbacks firing from a large open space into a tiny enclosed entryway environment. So that's a very common use case for the Cannonbacks, and it's very effective, especially if you can give the raider a reason, like Plasma Cloud Sentinels or Enforcers, whatever, to back away from the entrance for some distance. However, you should also keep in mind that there are a few things that you can do to improve this, and they're kind of subtle things, but they can really make the difference between a very basic trap setup that works sometimes and what feels like an extremely lethal combination. The first of those things is to keep in mind that the Cannonbacks are going to fire at the raider's last known location if they can't spot the raider anymore. If you give the raider a place to break line of sight from the Cannonbacks, try and make it one that is somehow useful to you. So for instance, if I have this setup up here, it's not terribly useful to me, right? It gets the job done, but the cannonballs are just kind of going to go wherever. If I was to instead, for instance, let's do a little bit of shaping here, and we're just going to add a little bit of shape there, and then we're going to block this off, block that off, and we'll do something like this. And now we have a much more reliable place for the cannonballs to land, right? Because it would help if Harvey could pass through here. Let's go ahead and do that. All right, so most raiders are not going to, well, in fact, let's go ahead and box this in just a little bit more. Most raiders are not going to attempt to jump up here, or if they do, they will naturally gravitate towards the left side of this particular area. When this Cannonback over here loses sight of me over this left side here, let's assume for whatever reason that I can't easily kill that Cannonback and that I am going to back away because there's just so much nasty in the room, right? So if I back away from this corner specifically, the cannonball will likely come flying through here. And there's a couple different ways I could use that. Again, I could put another corrosive cube here with opaque and splatter on it, preferably not hardened skin, that would just be silly. And that would probably throw a splatter out. It will probably make the cannonball a little harder to see. I can put this angled geometry here so that if I draw a line from that Cannonback through the most likely point for the raider to be standing as their last known location, I can say that that will very likely bounce off that angled wall and roll off that way, which makes backing away from the thing much more difficult. So if I can very carefully control where the Cannonback is going to see me and what angle it's going to fire at me from, I can much more accurately divert the cannonball to exactly where I want it, which is hopefully somewhere where it's more lethal for the raider. So taking a quick look at this in action here, we have a Cannonback there. He's going to fire at me. That's going to bounce off that corner. There is nowhere safe other than a couple of very tiny spots in this area where I can stand and be safe from that cannonball. Next, consider going vertical with your Cannonbacks. A Cannonback positioned well above the raider will often expose only a small part of its cannon while firing, and that makes it quite difficult for the raider to fire back. This can also mean that the raider often needs to grapple upwards to get a better shot or to reach the Cannonback to kill it in melee, and anytime the raider grapples away from Harvey's path should be seen as an opportunity. The builder can introduce unexpected traps in a variety of ways that just aren't possible while the raider is on the obvious pathway. You can do hollow cube flooring, you can do upwards firing traps, you can do bolt shots with homing firing up from the ground in unexpected directions. It's just really a nightmare for the raider when they have to leave the obvious Harvey pathway, and Cannonbacks are a great way to force the raider away from that pathway. Additionally, having a Cannonback firing downwards means it gains additional velocity from gravity, so you can introduce unexpected angle changes, and the bombs will bounce much further and faster than the raider would expect. Now, we can make use of that here in this little setup I've got. So we'll take a little closer look at the specifics of the setup in a moment, but for now I've got a couple of traps on either side. I've got that guard out there. There's enough out there I don't want to go outside. But I can't just easily back away either because that cannonball bounces off that slope and follows me back here, and it will do so in pretty much whatever direction I set out. So for instance, if I go out over here, well, in that case, the guard didn't aggro in time, so that's a thing you have to be careful of. You can maybe use a Bloodlust guard out there, like I tried to do with that Enforcer. Well, in this case, the Enforcer itself shot me. That's not exactly what I was trying to demonstrate. But, yeah, that cannonball will follow me basically on whichever side of that ramp I tried to drop back on. So you can kind of force the cannonball into basically wherever the raider is, and it's just going to feel awful for the raider because it seems like it's homing. The Cannonback can't possibly have known where they were. It can't even see them back there, and yet that cannonball follows them straight down the ramp in almost every circumstance. Another odd trick is to use Cannonbacks in narrow corridors as blockers for speedrunners. They have a longer range than Warmongers, they need to move less, and they're a threat that the speedrunner can't easily escape with just movement. Plus, they block as large of a vertical space as the Warmonger. So a pair of Cannonbacks in a diagonal hallway can be extremely difficult to avoid both the Cannonback itself and the shots from the Cannonback. and that almost forces you to kill them. And that can be quite dangerous to do depending on the raider's equipment, especially if there are two Cannonbacks in the hallway, and especially if they are firing in alternating patterns. If you've seen my video on enforcers, you'll remember that staggering the fire of a room full of enforcers makes killing them off much more difficult, since the raider can't stand still for even a moment to line up a shot or melee a guard without being hit by the enforcer. So Cannonbacks work exactly the same way. You can stagger their shots of even 2 to 3 Cannonbacks, and that can mean that the cannonballs are much more difficult to avoid, and that there's just a chain of explosions following the player around, and that's not something that any smart raider wants to deal with. So, yeah, in this case, I've got a narrow diagonal corridor here, and I'm using my light sword and arc barrier. I can try and grapple past these guys, and it's quite dangerous for me. Even if I get past them, they can spin on a dime and will launch a cannonball towards me. So even if I do get past the Cannonbacks, and I could have done a better job of packing those in horizontally to make them more difficult to get by, even if I do manage to get by them, there's still a high chance that they can turn around and shoot me before I'm prepared to deal with a cannonball. Anyway, that's all for today. Thanks for watching, I hope you have a great day, and I hope I'll see you next time. We're going to kick off a new type of video by diving into one of my favorite topics lately, which is how to make a great maze that's actually really fun to play. See you then.